September 24th, 2022. Well, I guess things have started happening in the Ukraine war now that we finally hear the result of Putin's reaction to, I guess, the Ukrainian offensive and his action and to the backlash maybe that's going on inside of Russia itself, which I think comes from both their more moderate or pacifistic forces and their more hawkish forces. And at any rate, what he's decided to do was to basically mobilize 300,000 reservists to flesh up the and replace the casualties that they've taken in the war so far. And the other thing that's kind of reached the consciousness of some people is this idea of which he made a nuclear threat. And so that's led to some reaction on various parts. One thing is the Thursday night broadcast of the Tucker Carlson show. He got very spun up on the whole idea of that this is leading to the most risky period for nuclear war in history, which I don't exactly agree with. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis was probably a more likely one, but fortunately we avoided that. But there are serious risks involved, and I want to kind of go into this a little bit. Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about this whole subject, at least, and I kind of hear it on both sides of the fence. And of course, my views are perhaps a little controversial as well, but I'll go ahead and state them anyhow. By the way, if you like these videos, again, I appreciate the subscriptions. Give me a like, which helps out with the algorithm and helps to get them out to people. And of course, you can click the bell for notifications. So what I want to address is first of all, nuclear war in some ways isn't what it used to be. We used to imagine a situation like at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, or let's say in the mid-'80s, during the Reagan era and before Gorbachev got in power, the massive nuclear arsenals that had been built up, which would have, if fully unleashed, would have been just a massive, overwhelming destruction. I mean, the ones today are quite smaller, although they're quite potent as well. I mean, I guess the difference is being hit with a burst of machine gun fire rather than one well-placed sniper round. Either way, you're dead, but one way your body's mutilated. All I'm trying to say is that the actual number of warheads is quite a bit lower, where we used to be talking about each side having strategic warheads in the range of maybe 10,000 warheads on each side. Now we're at a much lower level of about 1,550 or thereabouts on each side. And also the really large high-yield warheads have been greatly scaled back, at least on the Western arsenals, and I think mostly on the Russian side as well. So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is what's more likely to be relevant to the Ukraine war is tactical nuclear weapons. The thing about this is what we're probably talking about is the fact that after the end of the Cold War, during the 90s, during the big disarmament period, the United States pretty much scrapped almost all of its tactical nuclear weapons. We had all kinds of artillery shells, nuclear depth charges, nuclear armed Tomahawk missiles, weapons that were not really part of the real strategic arsenal, but were for tactical use. Battlefield missiles, Lance missiles armed with nuclear warheads, things of that sort. Gone. What we have left in the tactical nuclear arena is basically one thing, the B-61 gravity bomb. And of course, that comes in various modifications. There is a strategic variant, the Mod 7, which is presumably higher yield and is used by the strategic forces. The rest of them are the more tactical variants, which are used by Navy and Air Force tactical units, and are currently would be delivered by our planes such as F-16s, F-15s, and the F-18s. Would be the primary delivery mechanisms. There is a plan to shortly qualify the F-35 for the new 12 variant, which is a GPS-guided bomb, which is going to be coming into the inventory. But right now, I think we're back to the earlier variants now that have been around for years. And as I understand it, based on open sources, and that's the only ones I've got, and we're talking about retired generals on TV talking, there's about 200 of these weapons inside of NATO. And obviously there's others inside of the U.S. storage back in the United States. But the point is that that's not a very survivable deterrent because those bases are easily targeted by ballistic missiles. On the good side, from our point of view, is of course the INF treaty got rid of the old SS-20 missiles that the Russians had. At least that was a NATO designation, and so that method of targeting isn't there. On the other hand, the Russians have added various kinds of nuclear cruise missiles, and of course that so-called hypersonic missile that's launched off the MiG-31. That comes obviously in both conventional versions, which have been used to some degree in the Ukraine war, and others would be nuclear versions. And those, of course, could be used to target these bases, along with a certain amount of strategic warheads could be used on individual bases for this purpose as well. Or you could, anyway, so the point I'm getting at is it's hard to know how well we would survive a Russian strike of that sort. However, I don't think that's very likely that Russia is going to attack a NATO country with nuclear weapons as part of their supposed threat. There's a whole debate about the issue of how they might engage in defensive use. Now, right now, their rules of engagement supposedly are that they'll only be used to defend in the event of an attack on their homeland, which may be one reason why the eagerness of giving ATACMS missiles to Ukraine and letting them fire hundreds of kilometers inside of Russia may not be a good idea. Remember, Russia's formally annexed Crimea. We don't know whether attacks on Crimea would come into play or not. They've been attacked there so far, and they haven't responded. But as the more you push this thing, the riskier it could get. What I could conceive of, though, is that since the disarmament period, apparently the Russians have come in the Putin era have come back and have built a whole new class of tactical nuclear warheads, from what I understand. And probably a lot of these are probably what you'd call neutron type bombs, as they used to be called back in the old days, which is basically a thermonuclear device of very low yield, very low fissile yield also. And the fissile yield is what leads to fallout, and is designed to generate as much prompt radiation in the form of neutrons, gamma rays, and maybe hard X-rays as possible. Okay, and these things may be only about 1 kiloton or thereabouts, maybe a little bit, depending on what they chose to do. And yet it creates a radiation pulse similar to what you'd have with a traditional, let's say, the something just a little bit less or around the level of the Hiroshima bomb, okay, which is a lot lower yield in terms of blast damage, although it does have some. It doesn't leave all buildings standing. That's a myth. But it doesn't do as much blast damage, but it definitely puts out a really nasty radiation pulse, which is lethal, and can penetrate through armor on tanks and armored personnel carriers and stuff like that, leaving the occupants either dead or dying in the next several hours to a day or so. Really ugly. But the point is, it is an effective weapon, and that's apparently maybe what they've built. And these could be optimally airburst, creating a very minimal amount of fallout, really. I mean, yeah, more than people would want to have happening in their neighborhood, I understand. But, when you're a leader of a country like Putin is, whose two options are win or fall from power and perhaps not live, he just might be willing to take those minor risks in order to achieve a military goal. And so I could easily see that if the Russians are really pressed too hard, he may very well resort to using weapons of this sort on a moderate scale to smash offensive efforts by the Ukrainian army and to attack their logistical depots. And so the point I'm making here is this does not lead to this thing that Tucker Carlson had in his show, this massive exchange of ICBMs. And it doesn't lead to any particular military reaction from the point of NATO. I mean, if we have entered the war already, why do we enter it at that point? I mean, it seems to me that Russia is a much more dangerous country at this point than they would be if they weren't doing things like this. And also, it depends on, are we talking about a unilateral action on the part of the United States or maybe Britain? Or are we talking about a NATO action? Because the weapons I mentioned that are in NATO, the 200 bombs, I guess more could be flown in, of course. Those weapons would be part of NATO and presumably would require a NATO decision to go to war, a unanimous decision. And my guess is some countries are going to get cold feet on actually launching a nuclear attack. And also, who do you attack? What do you attack? What targets? Are we talking about bombing Russian troops inside of Ukraine, near the Russian border? Is that what we're talking about? Or Crimea? Are we talking about actually striking at targets into Russia itself, which seemed to be what Zelensky was discussing in the speech that was referenced in the Carlson show? So the first case seems to make not a lot of sense. I mean, Ukraine's going to be happy with both Russia and the United States or dropping nuclear bombs on their territory, or at least detonating them over them. The other possibility of actually attacking into Russia itself would be a direct attack on Russia with nuclear weapons by NATO, and presumably would lead to a response of strikes back at the bases from which these airplanes are flying at in Germany and Poland and so forth. And it could be a relatively low number of weapons being detonated, and they could probably avoid directly attacking France or Britain or the United States directly, which are the countries that could autonomously retaliate. And now what do we do? That's why I think that we really don't have good options. The other thing that's been discussed is, well, falls into the category of either just responding with a large amount of conventional air power, which certainly the NATO air power backed up the U.S. Air Force is quite formidable. I mean, or the idea of some form of horizontal escalation, such as engaging in naval operations against Russian interests, blockades and that sort of thing. So those are the kind of things that could occur. And of course, a lot of diplomatic things could be done, obviously. And we don't know. I mean, nuclear use on the part of Russia could lead to, serious tensions with China, for example, and with India and other countries in the international community. I think there's plenty of reasons why Russia would not want to do this, unless they were desperate. And that's the question: is do we want to make them desperate? And I think if we don't make them desperate, they aren't going to do it. But if we do, it's possible. And I don't think we have a good response. Like I say, none of the things I've suggested as responses seem to me to be good options at all. And what happens after some NATO air bases are bombed and some Russian bases are bombed? What do we do then? It looks like we would probably want to try and negotiate a ceasefire before this thing gets fatal. And the thing that a large-scale strategic exchange does occur, which, while it wouldn't be completely as devastating as it would have been, say, in the 1980s or back in the Cuban Missile Crisis period of the early 60s, would be sufficient to pretty much wreck both countries. And if we think we have supply chain problems now, we'd still have tens of millions dead, and the countries, both cases, in absolute shambles. Like I say, it's maybe it's not one well-placed bomb rather than several all over the place, but it still is devastating. We don't want that to happen. Nobody wants that to happen. And so, therefore, it looks to me like we're reaching a point where it would make much more sense to try and negotiate an end to this whole fiasco before it gets out of control, before any of this occurs, rather than letting it go into a stage where there has been some nuclear use and then trying to see if we can stop it before absolute catastrophe hits. But anyhow, I just thought I'd kind of go through this. That's the way I see the subject. I don't think that I think it's sort of advantage Russia in this situation if it goes into that area. Not because the ultimate outcome of a full-scale war would be any advantage to them, it wouldn't be, but rather the lower level of conflict would be their advantage and we'd have no real incentive to escalate. And I point out that if you look at classic arms control theory that goes back to Thomas Schelling and that sort of thing, the general idea is always to look for fire breaks in these things. And the biggest one, of course, is the one that most people are concerned with, which is don't use a nuclear weapon, period. Yes, that's the first fire break. Just don't use nuclear weapons. But the second fire break, I think, is don't attack a nuclear-armed country, one that's able to respond autonomously without anybody else's permission. And that's not Germany, but it definitely is United States, France, UK, and Russia. And so I think that's why I say that if Russia uses a limited number of tactical bombs against Ukraine to stop a successful Ukrainian offensive, I don't think that there's a good response to that doesn't violate the next threshold, which is don't attack a nuclear-armed country. And therefore, I think anyway, that's my assessment of the situation. I'm sure people have their opinions. And at any rate, I'll close with that. By the way, I'm encouraged with some of the responses I'm seeing on Rumble. We do a post on Rumble, and of course, you can follow me on my social media accounts, which are listed in the description below. And we'll close this for now.